Good morning. Today we are finishing up our chapter 13, the common good. Tomorrow we do have testing, the math testing. So it's going to be shortened academic day. So we're just going to have a little bit of time in class tomorrow. I will be passing out our chapter comprehension pages to work on tomorrow, and also on Wednesday is an art day. So when we have that extra homeroom time on Wednesday, you can use that to work on the chapter comprehension page. So just know that's coming out tomorrow, and you will have to have it done by Thursday. We will be correcting Thursday, reviewing on Thursday, and then test on Friday. So it's going to be a quick week with social studies. Last week, we left off on page 274, the progressive goal of assimilation. Before we start our reading, let's do a quick review of our key terms. Our chapter is called The Common Good. What is the common good, Ryan?
The belief that people should work for social and political changes that benefit everyone.
Yeah, the belief that people should be working for the benefit of everyone. Here's a spoiler, you're going to need to know that for the test. So make sure you know what the common good means. What is the progressive movement? Each of our sections is a progressive movement goal. So what is the progressive movement, Peyton?
A movement to solve various social, economic, and political problems through government action.
Yeah, it's that movement to solve all of those problems through government, through acts, through laws, trying to get it through the government to make sure that the common good is taken care of. Who is a reformer? Chase.
A person who works for changes they believe in for society.
Person who's working for those changes through the progressive movement for the common good. So the reformer is the person working for that. What is suffrage, Gabby? The right to vote. We learned about the women's suffrage movement of the early 1900s. We talked about the American Indians getting their right to vote. So just remember, when our country first started, it was not a right for everyone. Now, more and more people have gotten that right to vote, so it's more equal for everyone. What is a monopoly? Colin. Total control over that supply or service, supply of a product or the service. So it's like that Monopoly game. You want total control over all of the, what are they called? The properties. So in the game of Monopoly, you want all the control. In a Monopoly in real life, they want all the control over something. Are Monopolies a good thing? No. Think about when you're playing the game of Monopoly, you don't want your opponent to have all the properties. You don't want that because they have all the control. What is discrimination, Paul? Yep, so it's that discrimination, that unfair treatment of somebody based on a characteristic. So it's not right. It's not using the Catholic social teaching of treating everybody with dignity. What is an allotment? Edward?
Something that is either given or assigned.
That's the amount that you're given or assigned of something. We're going to be learning about allotments today, and we're also going to be talking about boarding schools. What is a boarding school, Ethan? Yeah, it's the school that children live away from their family. They live in a dorm area, not with their family. We're going to be talking about that and how that affected people here in Minnesota. All right, so page 274, progressive goal, assimilation. Many reformers believed that social problems often resulted from cultural differences among people. They thought it was important for people in the minority to assimilate and adopt the values and habits of the majority. Some of the assimilation programs that these reformers developed around the turn of the century were helpful. other programs ended up hurting the people they were designed to help. We can see the different ways these assimilation programs affected people by looking at the experiences of two groups, the Ojibwe in Minnesota and European immigrants who settled in the Twin Cities. So we learned quite a few chapters ago about assimilation and how, was it in the 1850s, 1860s, they really started a push for the American Indians to assimilate, to become more like the white settlers. So we're going to see what kind of programs they set up in the early 1900s to try to help them, if they were beneficial or not. Some parts of assimilation are good, some parts of assimilation don't go so well. So we'll see how it affected the Ojibwe, and we're going to see how it affected the immigrants, those European immigrants coming in. So the Ojibwe, by 1900, most American Indians, including Ojibwe in Minnesota, lived on reservations, separated from the rest of society. They had their own governments, religion, customs, and languages. They often resisted efforts by others to blend them into American society. So they wanted to keep their heritage, keep their culture, and not assimilate. So remember, they thought, if we live on the reservation, we can still be ourselves. The federal government tried to overcome this resistance by starting two new programs. One tried to change Native people's traditional relationship with the land. The other tried to force American Indian children to become more like European American children. So the allotment. In 1887, the federal government passed the Dawes Act, which enacted a policy called allotment. Allotment was designed to convert American Indian reservation land, which was held in common by the whole tribe, to land owned by individuals. This policy also meant to open up land left over after allotment to European Americans for settlement, farming, or lumbering. Remember, the American Indians said we all own the land, we all work it together. But that's not the way of the white settlers. The white settlers, everybody owns their own farm. Everybody owns their own piece of land. So they were trying to allot out the reservation land to the individual American Indian families. Under allotment, reservation land was divided among members of the tribe. Each family could claim up to 160 acres, which could then be farmed. The government thought this would encourage American Indians to become self-sufficient farmers and assimilate into American society. Those who agreed to become private landowners were also granted U.S. citizenship. This is before there was that act that made any American Indian a citizen. So before that. For many years before 1924, this was one of the only ways that Ojibwe and other American Indians could become U.S. citizens. But remember, 1924 is when they declared that any American Indian is automatically a U.S. citizen because they were born here. In Minnesota, many Ojibwe were cheated out of their land. Only a few of those who kept their land became self-sufficient farmers. Over the years, many Ojibwe were tricked or forced to sell their land. Eventually, European Americans owned most of the land within the boundaries of reservations. Only Ojibwe at the Red Lake Reservation successfully resisted the allotment policy. They kept their reservation intact and continued to hold their land in common. Allotment payments 100 years later. In the late 1990s, a group of Minnesota Ojibwe sued the federal government over unfair land deals that happened a century ago during the time of allotment. These Ojibwe claimed that some of their land had been sold for less than it was worth and that they had not always received payment for it. The case ended in 1999 when the U.S. government agreed to pay the Minnesota Chippewa tribe $20 million. The money covered the loss of their land and the income they should have received from land sales. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe includes bands with reservations at Boy Fort, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, and White Earth. These are all the Ojibwe bands in Minnesota whose reservations were affected by allotment. With so many different bands involved, dividing the money was complicated. It took 13 years to come up with a plan to pay the tribes. Governmental delay and disagreements among tribes over how the money should be split postponed the payout. During those years, the money was held in an account where it earned interest. By 2012, the sum had grown to $28 million. An agreement reached in 2012 arranged for part of the money to be paid directly to individual tribal members. The rest of it went to each of the Ojibwa bands. So it's not easy when you have that many people involved trying to figure out who was owed how much money, how should we spend the money. It's not an easy thing. So did allotment turn out to be beneficial, or did it hurt the Ojibwa? Yeah, it hurt them because they weren't paid the money they were owed. They weren't paid a fair amount of money for their land. So it wasn't a good thing. So allotment is something that did not work well for the Ojibwas. Boarding schools. In 1893, the federal government began requiring American Indian children, including many from Minnesota's Ojibwa reservations, to go to boarding schools. Usually, these schools were built off the reservations. Children who attended them lived away from their families and were taught to reject their people's ways of lives. So they were forced, they were required, they were forced to go away to boarding school. So think about that. This isn't older kids, this is younger kids too. Elementary age kids were forced to live away from their family. I know a couple of my kids, when they were little, they had a hard time going on a sleepover for one night because they missed being at home, and it was a little scary being at somebody else's house when they were little. These kids were forced to be away from their families for an extended period of time. They were forced to go to school elsewhere. And at that school, they were told, you need to become like the white settlers, not still doing your culture. The stuff that you've learned, what your family does on the reservation, they were told was wrong. So they were trying to force them to change their ways. Life at the boarding schools was very different from life on the reservation. One of the first things American Indian students had to do was learn English. That one kind of makes sense to me. They had no choice. They had to learn English. Makes sense because they're living in the United States where English was the main language now being spoken, so it's the common language. So they needed to learn it. They told us listen to this though. They told us they'd wash our mouths out with soap if we talked our own language, recalled one former student. American Indian children took courses in reading, writing, math, history, and geography. So when Mr. Gambino's dad came over from Italy, he spoke Italian. And at home, they spoke Italian. When he married his mom, they lived with her parents who had come over from Italy. At home, they spoke Italian. When they went out, they could speak English so they could communicate with people, but they still were able to speak Italian and hold on to that part of their life. These American Indian children were not allowed to speak their native language. They weren't allowed to speak it at all, not even back in the dorms with their friends. They were made to speak English at all times. That's kind of rough there. I understand them having to learn English because you need to be able to communicate with society, but they weren't allowed to speak their regular language. They also had to learn other skills that European American educators considered valuable. Boys learned how to be farmers, shoemakers, blacksmiths, and carpenters. Girls learned to be seamstresses, maids, and farm wives. The courses were designed to prepare American Indian children for lives off the reservation, even though many who attended boarding schools returned to the reservation once their schooling was done. Many American Indian students resisted the lessons of assimilation that their teachers forced on them. Some ran away. Others lashed out by vandalizing or damaging school property. Many gained a new sense of their American Indian identity by meeting and becoming friends with children from other Native communities. In many cases, the students' ties to their homelands were strong, too strong to be broken by the boarding schools. So these kids were sent away to the boarding school. They were told that what they were doing back on the reservation was wrong and they have to change their ways. And they were able to say, no, it's not. It's who we are. And we're proud of who we are. We're going to keep our culture, keep our heritage. So it kind of did the reverse. Instead of changing them to become more like the white settlers, it made them stronger in their culture, stronger in their community. They decided this is who we are and we want to hold on to it. You can't make us change. The government eventually realized its policy of sending American Indian children to boarding schools had not worked as planned. Instead, it started opening day schools on reservations. Most Native people preferred these schools because children returned home each day after classes. By 1910, Minnesota had more Ojibwa day schools than boarding schools. So they realized, okay, this is wrong. We're not getting the results that we wanted to get. So what else can we do? And even to this day, there are day schools on reservations, like the public schools that we go to here. They have those on the reservations. And I know there's a lot of mission trips that, like my church will go on a mission trip. We're partnered with the Red Lake Reservation, where we could go for a week and help teach at the school and help in the school. So that's something that's still going on today. We still have these day schools for the students to go to so they can learn the same stuff that other schools are learning, but they get to stay on the reservation. They get to keep their culture, their heritage, and be with their families. Wekwa Gilzig, Ojibwa boarding school student. Wekwa Gizig was 6 years old in 1896 when he and his two sisters were taken against their parents' wishes to attend a boarding school in South Dakota. So 6 years old, that's first grade. So he was in first grade when he was forced to leave his family. He lived on Minnesota's White Earth Indian Reservation and had not spent much time away from his family. Over the next 6 years, his teachers tried to make Wekwa Gizig stop thinking and acting like an Ojibwe. They gave him a new name, John Rogers. They told him to stop speaking the Ojibwe language. They discouraged visits and letters from his family. Eventually, Wekwa Gizig convinced his sisters to cut his long hair so he would look like the rest of the boys at the boarding school. Wekwa Gizig never forgot he was a Ojibwe, however. In 1902, he returned to the reservation with his sisters. Years later, he remembered what it was like to see his mother again. She looked up from her work, and we children made a mad scramble toward her. So remember, it's been 6 years since they've seen their mom. 6 years. What a reunion that was. She endeavored to gather us all into her arms at once. She started talking joyously, but we couldn't understand very well what she said, for we had forgotten much of the Indian language during our 6 years away from home. But all that mattered was we were welcome here in Mother's Wigwam, the home of our birth. Once back on his reservation, Wekwa Gizig relearned the Ojibwe language. He stopped calling himself John Rogers. He began to appreciate the traditions and customs of his people. After spending a year with their mother, Wekwa Gizig and his sisters left again for boarding school. This one was closer, in the town of White Earth on their own reservation. By then, he had come to resent the way his teachers tried to make him reject Ojibwe culture. I was beginning to realize that I was being forced to give up all that was dear to me, and it was not good that this should be done. Nothing the white man could teach me would take the place of what I was learning from the forest, the lakes, and the river. Later in life, Wekwa Gizig left northern Minnesota and settled in California. Before he died in 1972, he wrote a book called A Chippewa Speaks, which included his memories of boarding school. His widow explained that he was very much interested in and desired to preserve for the coming generations the Indian culture and way of life. He didn't want them to lose it. So, was the boarding school a good experience for him? Was it a good experience for many of the Ojibwe children? No, because they were forced to leave their families. They were forced to give up their language, forced to give up their custom and cultures. They were told that back home was wrong. So it was not a good experience. Now let's learn how the new immigrants did with assimilation. Immigrant communities developed in Minnesota's biggest cities during the late 1800s and early 1900s. The new immigrants often clustered in neighborhoods with people like themselves. They spoke their native languages and practiced the customs of their home countries. Some reformers worried that these new Minnesotans were not fitting in. They were not assimilating into American society quickly enough. Reformers set out to help the newcomers become full American citizens. These reformers wanted to Americanize the new immigrants. To do this, they set up programs at settlement houses, community centers where immigrants learned about life in their new country. The social workers who ran the houses organized classes in English, housekeeping, childcare, and citizenship. They also hosted festivals, folk dances, and other programs that made immigrants feel more at home. So they showed them ways to live in American society, and they also had parts of their culture from back home. Those folk dances and festivals, that was from their homeland. So they were combining both. The Northeast Neighborhood House in Minneapolis was one of the busiest settlement houses in Minnesota. It was located in a part of the city that was home to many recent immigrants. They came from countries such as Russia, Poland, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. They spoke little English. Often they were very poor. Each week, dozens of newly arrived immigrants spent time at the Northeast Neighborhood House. Young children sang patriotic songs and learned the Pledge of Allegiance. Adults took English classes and studied for citizenship exams. The director of the house believed that these programs gave immigrants a clearer understanding of American conditions and ideals. This knowledge, the director believed, helped immigrants become more intelligent citizens. Unlike the Ojibwa, who were forced to assimilate, new immigrants chose whether they wanted to participate in Americanization programs at settlement houses. Some resisted giving up their native language and customs. Others welcomed the opportunity to learn about their new American way of life. Most created a life that honored both cultures. So the key difference between the immigrants and the American Indians, where the immigrants were given a choice. You can choose to go to these settlement houses and learn English. You can choose to participate in becoming a citizen of the U.S. The Ojibwe, those American Indians, were forced. They were told you have to do this. Whereas the immigrants, they could do both. They could learn more of being in America and keep their customs from their old country. They could have that balance of both of them. The reforms of the progressive movement in the late 1800s and early 1900s demonstrated how positive and negative things happened when Minnesotans worked for what they believed was the common good. On one hand, government and businesses became more accountable to the people. Drinking water was made safer to drink, forests were protected, women and American Indians gained the right to vote. But on the other hand, the events of this period raised some troubling questions. Who decides what the common good is? Should people be forced to assimilate if the majority thinks it's in the public interest? So the majority would be the white settlers, the European settlers. The minority would be the American Indians. Do the American Indians have to change just because that's what the majority thinks? So this last section, the investigation part, I want you to read quietly on your own. Okay, so you're just going to read through that on your own. I'm not going to give us a worksheet to work on through it because we do have the big reading test tomorrow, so I don't want to be giving us a lot of work. I want us to be rested and ready for the reading test tomorrow. Yep, you're going to read that why is Miss R sick? It's talking about typhoid fever. We talked about the health concerns that were back then because they were just learning about quarantining. They were just learning about preventing the spread of illness, especially with that drinking water. So you're going to read what it was like back then with a big serious illness going around, how they handled it. So read that on your own. Tomorrow we can talk about it a little bit, about any thoughts that we have about it, and then we'll work on our chapter comprehension. So those of you at home, we hope you are well, and we hope to see you soon.